Welcome to session 2, and I would love to introduce our moderator, Dean Shonekan, who is professor of ethnomusicology and dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland. But she has also recently agreed, along with Dean Susan Rivera from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, to provide funding for the 1856 Project Summer Research Initiative. And we just wanted to make sure we acknowledge their generosity, as this will help support our 4 fellows. We have 2 of our fellows from our previous summer institute, so the fact that the deans are supporting this is a huge welcome, and we really appreciate it. And now I will leave it to Dean Shonekan.
All right, good afternoon. That was truly a very short intermission. Okay, so I'm very honored to be able to participate in this symposium. As a very new member of the UMD community, I am thrilled to see a campus walk the talk, especially since I'm coming here from other universities that do a lot of talking, but not much walking. And as we watch what is happening in different parts of the country south of the Mason-Dixon line, I see a campus here that is walking the talk, truly engaging with and coming to terms with the past as a way of preparing and positioning us to do the work that will take us to a more just future. The second reason why I'm excited is, as the new dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, I am compelled by the mission of the 1856 Project, because it resonates deeply with our identity as a college, whose diverse fields focus on framing and illuminating our society. That is who we were, who we are, and who we hope to be. That is what we do in the College of Arts and Humanities. I'm thrilled to work with staff and faculty of our college, as well as other colleges, to create opportunities for our students to gain the learning and experiences that they will need to take our society forward to that just future. And so I'm thrilled to introduce this panel that highlights that kind of work. Our university's College of Behavioral and Social Sciences provided the 1856 Project the opportunity to participate in its 2022 Summer Research Initiative. Our cohort brought together undergraduate students, faculty, and Lakeland community members to research the interconnected past of the university and its close neighbor. Our scholars, represented here by Mia Moore and Caylee Larios, will discuss their research methodology and share their findings from their investigation of trustees and nearby landowners who had economic or social connections to slavery and its impact on the Maryland Agricultural College. As the University of Maryland campus has expanded since its establishment in 1856, many neighboring small and large communities like Lakeland were affected. So our students, again, are Caylee Larios and Mia Moore. Caylee is a senior at the University of Maryland. She is double majoring in history, the College of Arts and Humanities, and criminology and criminal justice from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Her minor is in Asian American Studies. On campus, she is the co-vice president of internal affairs of the Asian American Student Union and director of design for the Multiracial Biracial Student Association. You can read more about her in the booklet. Mia Moore is a student at Roosevelt University. She's majoring also in history with minors in social justice and sociology. And she's just told me she will be pursuing a graduate degree in ethnomusicology like myself. So, very good. She is also a member of the honors program at Roosevelt, as well as a McNair Scholar and so many other things. Joining them on stage and representing the Lakeland community are Ms. Maxine Gross and Ms. Violetta Sharps-Jones. The Lakeland community formed around 1890 and was especially impacted by this collaboration and this project. SRI community scholars and Lakeland Community Heritage Project officers, Ms. Maxine and Ms. Violetta, will share selections from their decades-long research. They will also discuss how their community is partnering with University of Maryland as the leading voice in framing and sharing community narratives. Ms. Maxine Gross is a fifth-generation member of College Park's historic African-American community of Lakeland. Her family's contribution to the University of Maryland dates from the early 1900s, with employment by her great-uncle Ferdinand Hughes, great-grandmother, her grandfather, and father. She was the first of the family able to enroll at the university, completing a Bachelor of Arts degree in what college? College of Arts and Humanities. And Ms. Violetta is also a fifth-generation Lakelander and vice president of Lakeland Community Heritage Project, which, as you know, is a non-profit organization dedicated to documenting the history of the community. Both of them will talk about the work that they've done and their collaboration with our students. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the students to begin. They will speak for about 10 minutes about their work, and then they'll turn it over to our elders, who will also talk about the community, and after they've all gone, we'll have a chance to engage in a conversation. So please help me welcome our whole panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caylee. It's a pleasure to be in this room with such incredible people. This past summer, I had the privilege of being a Summer Research Initiative scholar and to contribute to the 1856 project, which culminated in my poster, which is titled Enslaved in College Park, the Greenleaf Family's Fight for Freedom and Community. So this is my poster. So as many of you may know, the Maryland Agricultural College was founded in 1856, and one of the founders' names was Charles Benedict Calvert, who was a slave owner, landowner, and contributed part of his Riversdale plantation to become the initial campus. And an adjacent landowner, planter, slave owner, his name was John Eversfield, and this was the person who I focused on initially during my research. So my initial research questions are, who was John Eversfield and what were his connections to the Maryland Agricultural College? Who did he enslave and what were their lives like? So this was one of the first things that I used in my research that my mentor and I came across. And this is particularly special because this is a slave advertisement posted by John Eversfield in 1853, and it lists a man named Gasaway Greenleaf. And Gasaway is not a typical first name for somebody, and it's extremely unlikely that an enslaved person would have a last name as well. So right off the jump, I quickly shifted my research to focus on finding out more information about Gasaway Greenleaf. So the next thing that I found was this will of John Eversfield, created in October 1857, that willed Gasaway, or bequeathed Gasaway, to John Eversfield's nephew, Matthias Eversfield. You can see Gasaway listed right there. And then the next thing I found was in the Maryland State Archives, and this was Eversfield's estate appraisal following his death in December 1857, and the appraisers listed all the property that was present at his estate at the time. So we can see that Gasaway's name is listed here as being a piece of property present on the Eversfield estate, and he's listed as being worth $900. And of course, slavery was abolished in Maryland in November of 1964, and following that, previous enslavers would petition to their government with lists of people who they owned in hopes of getting compensation for their lost property. And so we see here Ann P. Eversfield, who was John Eversfield's widow at this point, listing Gasaway Greenleaf in this petition to receive compensation for him. And it says he is 43 years old, male, good physical condition, slave for life. And the next piece of information I was able to find was a Freedmen's Bank record in DC, listing this is an account that Gasaway Greenleaf opened with this bank, and he was 52 at the time, living in DC, married to Maria Greenleaf, having children, Edward, Mary Louisa, Margaret, and Sarah. So we know that maybe he had some money or some kind of property that he needed to store. And then in the 1870 federal census, we see Gasaway's name, and he's living with his wife Maria and another lodger, Aaron Heatherman, in the 4th Ward, Washington, D.C. And from marriage records, we know that Gasaway got married to his wife in April 21st, 1969. And then we can see his son, Edward Greenleaf, was living with his wife, Charlotte, whom he married April 15th, 1869 in D.C., and living with their 1-year-old daughter, Harriet. And in the 1880 federal census, we can see that Edward Greenleaf is living with his wife, Charlotte, and their 3 sons, and also his father, Gasaway. So we know that at some point in between 1871 and 1880 that Maria Greenleaf had passed away. So then I further wanted to look at Edward Greenleaf and continue tracing the family up until as presently as possible, up to the future as possible. So I found Edward Greenleaf's name in the Washington Bee, which is an African-American newspaper publication in DC. I found his name here listed in June 1901 as being elected as the president of the trustee board for the Galbraith AME African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in DC. And his name popped up in many other newspaper articles, but this one in particular stood out, so I decided to use it. So this is talking about an excursion held by the church, which is to fundraise, but also connect with the community. It had activities, music, and such, and it says that Mr. Edward Greenleaf, too much credit cannot be given to him. And this was in 1903. And this was the distance of Edward Greenleaf's house to the church, from his house that he listed in the 1880 federal census to the church, and it was about a mile away. So we can see how Edward Greenleaf and a lot of previously enslaved people turned to the church as a way of having community, as a way of connecting with other people. And initially, when I started my research, we were able to visit the Riversdale House Museum, and an archivist there allowed us to view some records and some archival documents, and I was taking some pictures of them because I wasn't sure if it was going to be helpful later on. And then one day, I decided to look over the pictures that I had taken at the Riversdale House Museum, and this was one of the documents that I came across, and I was looking over the details, and I found a Gasaway listed. And again, Gasaway is not a typical first name for somebody. And this is listing, it's titled Negro Sold to Mr. Armfield. And Mr. Armfield was one of the biggest slave traders in Alexandria, Virginia at the time. And he would often send people that he bought in more northern parts down to Louisiana. And this is talking about people who were sold from the Seneca estate to him. And the Seneca estate was one of Calvert's estates. This is from Calvert's account book. And it was written circa 1830, 1860. And we know that Seneca estate was about 27 miles from Eversfield's estate. So when this Gasaway came up, I thought maybe there was a connection. So this Gasaway was listed as being 4 years old, sold for $175. And so I kind of tried to tweak the numbers a bit to see like what are the chances of a possibility that this Gasaway and Gasaway Greenleaf are connected. And so if this account book was written in 1845, then that would mean that Gasaway Greenleaf would have been about 25 years old at the time, while this Gasaway was 4 years old. So that would mean that Gasaway Greenleaf could have had a child when he was 21, and knowing the history of slavery, and that oftentimes people would be leased out to different plantations, work at different plantations, travel long distances, it's a very strong possibility that this Gasaway could have been Gasaway Greenleaf's son who was sold to the deeper south. And the last piece of information, most recent piece of information I was able to find was on Elijah Greenleaf, who was Gasaway Greenleaf's grandson and Edward Greenleaf's son, living with his mother, Charlotte, in DC. So this was the context in which the University of Maryland was founded. This was the context in which the founders of the university acquired their wealth and had the wealth needed in order to found this university. And this is really important in understanding how we are here right now of occupying this space. So thank you so much for listening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Moore. I'm a senior majoring in history with minors in social justice studies and sociology at Roosevelt University in Chicago, Illinois. As a part of the 2022 cohort of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences Summer Research Initiative, I presented my project entitled William Goldsboro, Alexander Keach, and the Maryland Agricultural College under the larger 1856 project of UMD. My responsibility on the project was to research and create biographical profiles for 2 individuals that interacted with the Maryland Agricultural College or its land, and also find out more information about the people that they enslaved. This was my final product at the conclusion of the program. We don't often do posters in history, but I thought when supplemented by a narrative explanation of the work that I did, that it did an adequate job of representing my research. It was only after being invited to speak at the symposium that I realized I fell short in my work. I realized that I subconsciously strayed from one of the project's most important goals when trying to turn my poster presentation into a slide presentation. I mentioned in my poster the importance of using lesser-known stories to disrupt and expand larger narratives to create more complete histories. And this is what I wanted to do by exploring the stories of enslaved individuals as well as their enslavers. However, I spent most of my time, most of the poster, and even the poster's title doing the exact opposite, focusing mostly on the enslavers. So I would like to use this presentation to shift my focus to reflect my initial goals. And thank you. So I think the first step in accomplishing this mission is to appropriately retitle my presentation, which I now call The Lost and Marginalized Voices of the Maryland Agricultural College. Some of the earliest people to interact with the MAC were involved in the slave economy as either enslaved or enslavers. Though I'm unsure if enslaved laborers were physically laying the institution's bricks or working at its facilities, none of it could have been possible without the wealth that they generated for not only their enslavers, but also the state of Maryland. And without them, UMD would not be what it is today. Originally, with my research, I wanted to find out more about neighboring landowners to the MAC, its board of trustees, and ultimately, what was life like for people enslaved around the MAC? But I think a better question that encompasses each of these inquiries is, why is it important for us to know the stories of enslaved individuals and their enslavers in relation to these spaces? Why should we understand these spaces in relation to these stories? In her book, Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, Catherine McKittrick makes many points in the introduction that reference the importance of recognizing how power operates in storytelling with respect to space. She says, quote, "The relationship between Black population and geography, and here I'm referring to geography as space, place, and location in their physical materiality and imaginative configurations, allows us to engage with a narrative that locates and draws on Black histories and Black subjects in order to make visible social lives which are often displaced, rendered ungeographic," end quote. I think this quotation implies that we each have an obligation to use our scholarships in projects like the 1856 project to ensure that the humanity is kept in the telling, retelling, and analysis of the stories of enslaved individuals. Because without that, otherwise they may be lost, marginalized, or intentionally erased from memory and academia. I would now like to move into some of the people whose stories I had the honor of learning. To represent the people who were enslaved, I will be discussing. I included this picture from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello Museum commissioned by Titus Kafer. My choice in using this picture is not to imply that the individuals are invisible or insignificant. Rather, I'm attempting to communicate the intentionality behind the difficulty in locating and telling their stories and showing their faces. This is not meant to belittle or create a monolith of their identities. So the first individual is Robert Bennett, whose story is well documented based on a project in the Maryland State Archives. From these records, we know that Bennett joined the Army in 1863 and was discharged in 1865 because of an injury. He was married twice. His first wife was named Lydia, and together they had 2 children whose names are unknown. He died in Cambridge, Maryland in 1913. The next 3 names, Rhoda Gamby, Sarah Bennett, and Emma Williams, were each listed as domestic servants in William Goldsborough's household in the 1870 census. This would have been post-emancipation, meaning they were technically no longer enslaved, if at any point they were enslaved by the family, which leads me to speculate that perhaps at some point they were. Rhoda Gamby's name appears again in the 1880 census record in William Goldsborough's widow's household. He would have died in 1876, which is why his name, Rhoda Gamby's name is not under his household. Each of the individuals that I just named may have been enslaved by a man named William Tillman Goldsborough, a politician who served on the Board of Trustees of the MAC in 1859. He was married to Mary Eleanor Lloyd, who was the daughter of Edward Lloyd V, the owner of the Y Plantation and former enslaver of Frederick Douglass. From the 1860 slave schedules, we know that he enslaved at least 55 individuals. The Tillman family name, his middle name, may have been a prominent family in this area, so future directions related to Goldsborough could be to look into that family and their connections to the slave economy in Maryland. The next individual I had the privilege of learning their story was Charlotte Wright, whose name appears in the 1864 slave statistics as being enslaved by C.S. Keach, an heir of Alexander Keach. Because of Alexander Keach's will in the 1864 slave statistics, there are a lot more names available for the individuals that he enslaved. From these records, we also know that Charlotte Wright had an infant, a baby boy, at the time of the document's recording. The difference between slave schedules and slave statistics, our slave schedules are less detailed because they were just tallies, just counts of enslaved individuals, and often didn't even include their names. Slave statistics often have more details because enslavers wanted to provide as much information as possible because they wanted to be compensated for their property losses. In the 1880 census, Charlotte Wright's name appears again as a servant and cook in Mary Keach's household, and she was one of Alexander Keach's daughters. Again, this was post-emancipation, so perhaps she remained associated with the family even after she was technically no longer enslaved. Charlotte Wright, among many other names, was enslaved by Alexander Keach, an educator and neighboring landowner of the MAC. His lands were northeast of Charles Calvert's. Based on numbers from the 1860 slave schedules, he enslaved at least 20 individuals, but based on numbers from the 1864 slave statistics and his last will, that number may have been close to or possibly over 30 individuals. Alexander Keach's land was eventually sold to a developer named Edwin Newman, and eventually it became the historically Black community of College Park called Lakeland. A question for future directions concerning Keach could be, given his proximity to the MAC and his role as a passionate educator, why was he not more involved in the founding of the Maryland Agricultural College? I want to wrap up by referring again to McKittrick's book, specifically the definition of demonic that she includes, which I believe applies to my work and the entire 1856 project. McKittrick uses the definition of demonic common in math and science fields, which describes a working system that cannot have a determined or knowable outcome. The demonic, then, is a non-deterministic schema. It is a process that is hinged on uncertainty and nonlinearity because the organizing principle cannot predict the future, end quote. The work we do is, in this sense, demonic. We are never completely sure of what we will find or what questions we'll end up answering regardless of what we initially planned to do. This is one of the most beautiful things about history and research. Even if we study the past, we don't necessarily have all the answers. We are engaged in an ongoing puzzle with an unknowable outcome. And I think we should find comfort in this because it means that we'll never run out of things to learn or stories to preserve and tell, as long as we keep looking, even if it's unclear exactly what we're looking for. Thank you.
Wow. I'm honored to be sitting next to such thoughtful, brilliant young people. I've been told to talk into the mic. First, I'll say thank you for allowing us time today to talk about the Lakeland Community Heritage Project and the work that we've been pursuing for a bit over 2 decades. This is an opportunity to move along the process that the 1856 project holds as a goal and to actually start identifying the historical connections with the U.S., with U.S. slavery and its legacies. Those legacies are the primary study of the Lakeland Community Heritage Project. So today we're going to guide you through a short glimpse into some of the research that the project has been doing and looking at materials that come not only from the university's archive, but also the Lakeland Digital Archive, a project that we began many years ago and that has been added to by the work of members of the university community, including Dr. Mary Sees, who's unfortunately not able to be with us today, but also the Maryland Institute Technology and their distinguished team. So this is our goal as a heritage project. And we heard a little bit about Lakeland a few seconds ago, and many of you may not know where it is, but if you've ever visited Lake Artemisia, you've been to Lakeland. That is the area that was once the eastern part of the community, actually, where my colleague Mrs. Jones's family home was at one time. Lakeland was established about 1890 as a European American community and transitioned into an area where African Americans made their homes around 1900. Actually, it's right across from North Gate on the other side of Campus Drive. The transition to an African American community was a somewhat difficult one. This is an article that was in the Washington Post in 1900 describing some mysterious fires that took place as European Americans made their flight from the community. By 1903, Lakeland was an established African American community with 2 churches and a school. One of the distinctions of Lakeland is the fact that it is adjacent to College Park Airport and the airfield where a lot of early experiments in aerial equipment took place. And so thus we have this early aerial image of Lakeland and the surrounding area. You'll be able to see the railroad tracks. Hopefully you can pick those out. And the fisheries operation that was in Lakeland at that period. You may know this image. It's been used on a lot of the materials of the 1856 project. And you may not know that the individuals shown here are Lakelanders. The 1900 census showed us that a number of Lakelanders were working on campus, and among them are several members of the Dory family. And one of those, the descendants of the Dorys, is with us here today, Mr. Harrison Dory. Oddly enough, the final gentleman there that is not a Dory is one of my relatives, Mr. Hughes. You know, that image was found a number of years ago when the Heritage Projects first started delving into the history of the community. And researchers from the university were able to find the image, but they didn't know who those individuals were. Through talking with various senior Lakelanders 20 years ago, we were able to get the names of those gentlemen. More recently, other information was found within the university's archive that tells a little bit more about what those individuals' lives were like as employees here on campus. The next image that I'm going to share with you is one that we find extremely difficult to look at. It's hurtful, it's disrespectful, it's shocking, but I think it shows an important part of the African American experience here in what became the University of Maryland. This is an image from a 1916 yearbook at the university. It depicts Mr. Charlie Dory, Mr. Harrison Dory's ancestor, along with Mr. Samuel Stewart, who was also a Lakelander. His father was the founder of one of the historic churches, Emory African American Church. In looking at this image, I see people that I grew up with being held as people in great esteem. And I see them being depicted in ways that are hurtful and on some level disgusting. But I also think about the fact that they were likely extremely aware of how they were pictured. And I try to contemplate what that meant to them and how that impacted their lives and the lives of the people that they touched. I also think about the fact that these same individuals in their own community were leaders. They were parents, that they saw that their children were educated, not here, of course, but they taught their children and their grandchildren and their neighbors the honor of work and the need to continue to strive. Also looking through the records of the university, researchers working with a class on collaboration with Quint Gregory Henry. We were able to come up with some ledgers. This is a page from a ledger of 1919. And initially, the researchers were able to find, the student researchers were able to find some of the names that they were already familiar with, and they're highlighted here. But when Mrs. Jones and I took a look at those same ledgers, these are some of the Lakelanders that we were able to identify. So it gives you a small concept, into an inkling of the impact of the University of Maryland on the Lakeland community. This is a copy of a page of a document that was discovered, and it lists the names of individuals employed at the agricultural college, where they lived, the type of work they were doing, and their annual salary. Again, on that document, we are able to find a significant number of Lakelanders, most of them working in the domestic department, and others in other parts of the college, but doing domestic types of work or as laborers. I was able to look at the census and locate some of those individuals that were Lakelanders, of course, but also people we could identify as European Americans. And with that information, we're able to compare the salaries of the African Americans who are working as laborers versus the salaries of the European Americans. And of course, there is a significant distinction in the pay rates of those two groups of people. And I will turn it over to Mrs. Jones.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am extremely glad to be here today to speak to you about the university. I'm so proud of the 1856 project, proud that Maxine and I and others were asked to be part of it. I think it's very, very important that we all know the connections of the university, its beginnings, the middle part and current part, and how it affected neighboring Lakeland, African Americans of Lakeland, and greater than that, the African American corridor along Route 1 corridor, and all the other African American communities. There were several of them that range from the Washington, D.C. line, Mount Rainier, Cottage City, North Brentwood, Hydesville, Melrose, Bladensburg, then Riverdale, College Park, Ammondale, Beltsville, Merkert, Rossville, Laurel, Savage, Maryland. It goes on. So this does not just affect Lakelands. We don't want to just look at the Lakeland experience and connection to the university. We want to learn more about how it impacted all of them. And it also goes beyond the Route 1 corridor. I have been a genealogist and researcher for many years now, and it's taken me in many, many directions. I first started just simply to get my own family history. Since I have quite a connection to Lakeland, of course, I started there. I also was a little girl that had no grandparents. I knew none of my grandparents on either my dad or my mom's side, and I was so saddened by that because everybody in Lakeland had a grandparent, and most of them had the grandparents living in the household with them or next door. And I was born in the family house that had been with them in 1907. And as I talk more, you'll see that I was part of the original settlement of Lakeland. And my family purchased that home in 1907, and they were all on the census records as early as 1900. So the process that Lakeland went through, it's University Connections, and then later the aftermath of urban renewal, it has a very special meaning to me and all of us. This example here, we're getting in more to talking about some of the people in Lakeland. Through my research, I did not know this gentleman, but through my research, I found out that he was actually my step-grandfather. And in his later life, after my great-grandmother died, he resided with the Dory family. And when I found this information, I said, this is 1931. And then on some of those ledger pages that we found, we also found that he was working at the University of Maryland many, many years. And he lived until 1942 in Lakeland. When I look at this, which is a newspaper article talking about an accident, and I said to myself, wow, was he compensated? You know, what happened? Did he end up with scars? I have no photos of him. Sometimes we just don't think about what the impact of some of these things. I also found this interesting, I shared it with Maxine. On other records, it had said that he was a fireman. And after reading that letter, I realized that a fireman was considered to be someone that worked in this house, you know, where the plant was, where they were called firemen, because that's what they cared for. This is also Mr. Ferdinand Hughes, who is Maxine's, is it uncle, great uncle or something? Yeah, he also was in that first picture that you saw of the Dory family in the kitchen. So he was one that we've been able to identify, that he was part of the staff. And his family, and we also found supporting census records that not only showed him working at the University of Maryland, but even his sister worked at the University of Maryland. And this census record, which is 1920, we've highlighted those that we have been able to document that they were employed by the university. And Lakeland, if I could say one thing about Lakeland, it's the families. It's the families that grew Lakeland, the families that remained there. And this picture depicts Mr. Victor Randall and his siblings, and they were a Lakeland family that was connected to Lakeland and still is connected to Lakeland today. It's important that you know that in the struggles that Lakelanders may have had, because when I did my research, unbeknownst to me at the time, I found out that most of the original families that came to Lakeland, they came from parts of Virginia, Westmoreland County, Caroline County, Charles County, Anne Arundel County, St. Mary's County, and beyond. But the first ones that came, they were born around 1851, and all of them that I've been able to document were enslaved. So just think for a moment what it must have been like for people that have survived slavery. And even if they themselves were not slaves, they certainly had firsthand stories from their parents and grandparents. So they know what that was like. But when they came to Lakeland, even though they struggled, they knew the importance and what was needed to grow their families and their community was to educate them. So they began their schools. Lakeland had 2 Rosenwald schools, an elementary one that went from grades 1 to 3. It was a 2-room classroom, so they went from 1 to 3 and then from 4 to 6. And once they completed that, they moved over to the Lakeland High School. And the Lakeland High School is a very important part of Lakeland's history, especially to the state of Maryland, to Prince George's County, because it was the one and only high school for the central part of Prince George's County from 1928 to 1950. We had one principal, and I think you can see him in this smaller picture that has more of the gentleman. One principal that we had for the whole entire time that Lakeland High School existed was Edgar A. Smith. This gentleman was educated at Morgan University, got his master's. He lived in Baltimore, and he was so committed to the growth and education of Lakelanders that he commuted. I mean, he started out commuting, and then he became part of the community, and he literally lived with one of the Mack families that we also have determined were early employment with the University of Maryland. And he stayed with them, came in on Monday morning, and left on Friday. You know, I guess the commute was so much. So Lakelanders were always, it's just the root of the families. I love these pictures, the few pictures that we've selected. This is a family reunion that they usually have every other year, and it's generated by the Smith and Hughes family, the top one. And then this is the Potts family, which was a very large family in Lakeland. And all at some time, different ones have had connections with the University of Maryland in employment. And that family over there happens to be my mom and dad. My mom at some point worked at the, I think it was the physics department, the University of Maryland. She also was in education. She taught, but she also had to have other jobs too, you know. And that's my dad. And one of the many jobs that my dad had was he was chef when the first adult education building was built on campus. He was a chef there. And then later he moved on to do the fraternities. And the two children, one is me on my mom's lap, and that's my older sister, Pamela. Through research, we were able to find this photo of Mr. Dory that was talking about his connection to the university. And the family itself, we've documented, was there from 1893. And Mr. Dory, which would have been the grandson or son of Charles Dory. And you know, when I look at this and look at his accomplishments, and I knew him very well, and we always thought of him as the chef at the University of Maryland. But what I want to instill in, even though you see from the photos that have been depicted that there was a lack of respect, but when Mr. Dory, Mr. Mack, the Briscoe, all of them, when they came home, whatever feelings they had about their employer, when they came home into the community, they were the ones, we looked up to them. They were the deacons in the church. They were the entrepreneurs of the communities. They had the stores, they had owned the barbershops. They were so connected to the family. So even though they were depicted in negative ways or what have you, they didn't let that stop them. When they came to home, they were elevated. They were elevated. And what they shared with the younger generation is just, can't replace that. I mean, they taught us all to to go further, and that's what we hold on to. This is just some of the other ways that, you know, the university depicted. And I think my question to you is, what would it have been like if this was not the environment that they were in? How far could they have gone? How far could we have gone had we felt that it was a possibility for us to come to the university as students? But that did not stop us. We look forward to going to our Black universities, to Morgan and Howard and Maryland State. So we knew that we needed to go further and be educated. This is from, they used to have city directories way before, you know, you had to even real telephone book. And it's been, when you're researching, it's just such a remarkable thing to see. Now, this is from 1963, but some of the city directories go way back to the 1800s. So it gives you a good idea of who's in the community, and it usually tells you, you know, what kind of services they can provide. And this is one that is just loaded with all Lakelanders, and it gives you also the information of what type of jobs that they had at the university. And I love this picture because this is from 1965 to 1966, and all those little faces that we've managed to circle, we knew that they were living in a household where their parents worked at the University of Maryland. You have Maxine and her sister, you have my baby sister, and it's just so many. And they benefited from that because this group is truly the group that went on to colleges and were able at some point to get into the University of Maryland. And we just like this article because it just talks about the lost, the dreams that Lakelanders have. You have to realize that this was not even a community that was supposed to be for us. But because of things happening and the economic turns, that the wealthy white people came and they lost a lot of money and they abandoned the properties. Lakelanders came because they were looking for a better place to live, a better place to grow their family. They were working side by side or living side by side in very smaller homes, supporting the larger families that had come, mainly from DC, because it was so connected to the railroad line and not the subway, but the streetcar was coming through. So they built these homes for their summer homes and weekend homes. But when that market collapsed and the blacks were right there and they were building, they were laboring, they were, they had their gardens and they were selling their crops and they were working at the university. So what happened with urban renewal? And that's a whole long process for us to talk about, but we did just want you to know that we do see the light at the tunnel, maybe. This is talking about the Restorative Justice Commission that has been formed, and that the City of College Park has made the announcement that they have acknowledged their part in the wrongdoing, the harm that they have done. And so we are hopeful that through community engagement, truth and reconciliation, all the things that we're trying to do will help in that process. And 1856 Project just partners with that. And that's just going to help us all to have a better understanding.
So I've asked for a few more minutes for some questions. So if you have a question, please make your way to the microphones in the middle of the aisle. Really excited to hear this work that's been done, and very, very inspired as someone who works in the humanities. As people keep saying that the humanities is no longer relevant, I'm struck by what Mia said about the fact that there's so many stories that we still need to tell, and so many communities that have histories that need to be revealed and unpacked. All right, so let's start with Dr. Bonner, I think. Yes, please.
Hi, so I'm Chris Bonner. I teach in the history department here. First, just thank you all for the work you've done and for presenting it. I guess I'm going to ask maybe a pretty dry academic question. I'm interested in, so I really love how local this is and how much, to me, to your point, how important it is to understand people by thinking about them in the places where they lived. But I wonder if there's a way to think about, that y'all might want to think about the things you talked about today in larger ways. So on one hand, I think there might be some stories in here that sort of speak to Maryland as a distinctive place, as a state that's different from other states. So I wonder if there are things in your research that you found that might make you think about Maryland in that way. But then, on the other hand, I wonder if there might be things that might help you think about these stories as reflections of the South more generally, especially like that yearbook saying the South will rise again. So, you know, these stories as Southern stories, or these stories as sort of American stories more generally. So how might you think about these local histories as, or within larger geographies?
Well, I'll just say that the more I research on a personal level, and whether I'm doing things for Lakeland or for other people, what you quickly realize is that Lakeland's story is not unique. Okay, let's acknowledge this. This is not a unique story. This has happened to so many communities in different states, different parts of the country, and not just the South either. So the more we talk about it, the more we have the 1856 projects, Lakeland Heritage Project. It doesn't matter which project it is. Getting that exposure, and if I could ask you all to do one thing today, it would be to walk out of here and have a conversation with someone about what we talked about today, about Lakeland, because that's what's going to help us all grow. To know the Riverdale story, to know the Lakeland story. So just, if you could just open up conversation and talk about, because so many people, how long have you been here in this area and don't know anything about Lakeland? That's the thing that I constantly get. That's what motivates me. And I'm going to tell you, I came here today under a little bit of stress, but it was important that I come and share the story. And not only that, but I recently lost someone very close to me. So Lakeland has lost another person from that generation that had a lot to tell, a generation, a person that went through a lot. So I thought of her today. I said, you know what, I've got to go. Pain or no pain, I'm here.
All right, we'll have one more question, and I know you were up for a question earlier, right?
I'm going to ask the same question.
So you can ask the same question. Okay, carry on,
Yeah.
please.
Hi, my name is Antonia. I work for the Office of Community Engagement here at the University of Maryland. I'm a big fan of both of your work. We work closely with the Lakeland community in the past. And I actually had two questions. One was for the young researchers, because I know they probably weren't going to get as many questions. I just wanted to know what the most interesting thing that you found in your research was for each of you. And then to these lovely ladies, I wanted to, comment and ask. I know all of us in this room are very interested in getting involved and spreading the word, and perhaps you already answered my question as to what the number one thing you can do when you leave this room is. But if either of you had any other insight as to how, as a university and as representatives of the university, we can build trust in those relationships and how we move forward. That's a lot, I know.
So Mia and Caylee, do you want to start real quick?
I'd have to say for me, the most interesting thing that I came across in my research was just all the different names and all the different people and all their stories that I could have interrogated, but of course time restraints. So yeah, there's just so much more to be found.
Thank you.
I can echo what Caylee said, just the amount of stories that we could have investigated but didn't have time to. But I also found this letter between Alexander Keach and Thomas Jefferson, where Keach was like asking questions about the University of Virginia, and he was kind of being dramatic, like asking how he can help like get the school open because it was so important to train the next generation, things like that. I just thought it was an interesting letter.
As to how you can help, I would say the best way to engage is honest, willing to learn yourself, and most importantly, to not think of this as something that you do one day and it's over with. If you're going to walk in the community, and you make that a sustained visit. And you work with what the community is trying to do and not just looking to serve your own agenda.
Thank you. I think amplifying community voices is very important to the work. Thank you.
So as I wrap us up and ask us to give them one more round of applause, I do want to also say, just a minute, I do also want to say how grateful I am as an immigrant that somebody like me could never have been a dean at this university without the work that you and your ancestors did. So I'm very grateful. I think there are immigrant populations in and around Prince George's County that should be close to this, this work and this information so that they can stand in gratitude to the work that was done by Mr. Dory and so many others. So thank you all for this wonderful panel, and let's be obedient and do what Ms. Maxine said. Thank you very much.